The sky was not blue, and the ground was not familiar, and the air felt heavy, like it did not want to be breathed yet he breathed anyway because that was all he could do right now, and the pain in his side kept reminding him that he was still alive, even if he did not want to be in that moment, because everything hurt and everything felt lost, and even his name seemed far away in a fog he could not reach through. He opened his eyes slowly and saw a pale sun in the sky surrounded by drifting clouds shaped like creatures he had never seen before, and the wind whispered through the cracked trees that bent and swayed like they were speaking a language older than time, and his body was covered in dust and ash, and pieces of his escape pod lay scattered around him like broken memories. His hands trembled as he pushed himself up, and his legs were weak and shaky, and he felt the cold touch of this strange world against his bare skin, and there were cuts on his arms and bruises on his chest, but somehow he was still breathing and his heart was still beating, even though the world around him looked like it had been torn apart. He did not remember how he got here, and he did not know where here was, and his last memory was the alarm screaming in his ship in a blinding flash before everything went dark, and now he was alone, without tools, without clothes, without anything but the will to move and survive. He stumbled forward step by step through grass that shimmered like metal, and flowers that blinked open like eyes watching him, and each sound made him turn, sharply thinking some creature would leap from the shadows, but nothing came, only silence, only wind, only his own broken breathing. He found a shallow stream flowing over smooth stones, and he knelt beside it and drank deeply, and the water was cold and strange, but it filled his dry throat and gave him the strength to keep walking, and he followed the stream, hoping it would lead somewhere that felt less like the end of the world. As the light dimmed and shadows grew long, he reached a small hollow beneath a cliff where vines draped over jagged rock like curtains, and he crawled inside, curling up on the cool ground and trying to forget how empty his stomach felt and how loud the silence was. Then he heard it, a sound soft and strange, and not the wind, not an animal. It was a whimper, a small voice, full of fear and sadness, and he froze, listening closely, heart pounding with sudden alertness, and then he heard it again, coming from behind a fallen tree covered in thick moss. He crawled toward it slowly, carefully, like approaching a dream that might vanish, and when he looked over the tree, his breath caught in his throat because there, curled up in the dirt, was a figure, small and still and clearly not human, with skin that shimmered like moonlight and hair like strands of silver thread tangled in leaves. It was a girl or something close to it, and her arms were wrapped around her knees, and her body was shaken, and her eyes were wide with terror and confusion, and her clothes were torn and stained, and her feet were bare and scraped, and she looked as lost as he felt. He did not know what to say, and she could not understand him anyway. So he raised his hands slowly, showing they were empty, and he took a step closer, and she flinched, but did not run, and he pointed to his chest, then to her, then to the ground between them, trying to say, "We are the same, we are here together, we are not enemies." She watched him with eyes that seemed to shine in the fading light, and slowly she loosened her grip on her legs and tilted her head as if trying to understand, and he sat down cross-legged, a short distance away, not touching, not moving, just sitting and breathing and waiting. Night came fast on that world, and the stars above looked like spinning wheels and glowing rivers and strange shapes that did not belong in any map, and the cold crept into their bones, and he noticed she was shivering harder than before. So he tore a piece from a heat wrapping that had fallen from the pod and slid it toward her. She took it slowly, eyes locked on his, and wrapped it around her shoulders and nodded once, and though no words were spoken, something passed between them, something fragile and new, like the first leaf after a storm or the soft sound of music in a broken place. They huddled close near the cliff wall, without touching but sharing what little warmth they could, and in the darkness they listened together to the faraway sounds of this strange planet. And though neither could sleep, they both kept their eyes open because they knew something was out there, something watching, something waiting in the middle of the night. A low hum echoed through the valley, a sound too steady to be natural and too cold to feel alive, and both of them looked up at once, eyes wide and breath frozen, and in the sky a soft red glow passed by, hidden partly by clouds, but clearly something. Flying, something searching. He pulled her close, not to protect her, but because the fear in her eyes was the same fear in his, and she did not pull away. Because even though they were strangers, and even though they came from different worlds, they both understood one thing in that moment. They were not supposed to be found. When the glow faded and the humming stopped, they did not move. They just waited for morning, waited for hope, waited for anything that would make them feel less afraid. And as the sky began to turn pale again, and the wind picked up, and the birds of that world began to sing in voices that did not belong in dreams, he looked at her, and she looked back, and for the first time since he had woken up on that strange world, he did not feel completely broken, he did not feel strong, and he did not feel safe, but he felt something else. Something small and steady like a seed trying to grow in ashes, and that was enough for him to keep going, even if he did not know what would come next. He knew one thing for sure: he was not alone anymore. Morning came slowly across the strange land, and the cold faded as golden light touched the tops of distant trees, and the creatures of the planet stirred with strange voices calling in patterns that echoed through the valley, and in the hollow beneath the cliff. The humans stirred, and the alien girl blinked against the rising sun that lit their faces and warmed the earth around them. He stretched his arms with a wince as his muscles ached from sleeping on hard stone, and his back was sore and his throat dry again, but he did not complain, because something in him had changed in the night. Something quiet, but strong, like a silent promise made in the dark. She was already awake, sitting with her knees hugged to her chest, staring at the sky like she was searching for something far away, something that would not return. And he watched her for a moment before standing up, slowly brushing dust from his legs and stepping out into the light. The forest beyond shimmered with colors that moved like liquid, and the ground was soft and springy and filled with roots that glowed faintly under the soil. And he moved, carefully scanning the area for anything that looked edible or safe, and he remembered old training about survival plants' fire signals. But here nothing looked familiar, and every step felt like a guess. After some time he found a low bush with thick purple fruits hanging in clusters, and nearby there were signs that animals had bitten them and survived, and he picked a few cautiously before turning back toward the hollow, hoping she was still there and had not vanished like a dream. She was waiting exactly where he left her, eyes locked on his hands as he approached, and he crouched near her and gently placed two of the fruits on a flat rock between them, then took one and bit it, showing her it was safe, though the taste was bitter and strange, and left his tongue tingling slightly. She picked up the other fruit with careful fingers and sniffed it before biting. Just a small piece, and after a few seconds she ate the rest, slowly, then reached for another, and the two of them sat there in the shade, chewing quietly, and for the first time their hunger did not feel endless. He smiled weakly, and she looked at him with a puzzled expression, as if trying to understand the meaning of the curve on his lips, and then her own mouth shifted just slightly, not quite a smile, but something close, something that said she understood enough. Later, they sat by the stream again, and he began to draw shapes in the mud with a stick, simple lines of stars and ships and people, and she watched closely, and after a while she took the stick and drew her own shape, circles connected by lines, a large shape that looked like a planet, and a smaller shape with flames coming from one side like a ship crashing. He nodded slowly, pointing to her, then to the drawing, and she nodded back and drew three small figures near the crashed ship. One was crossed out, the others were circled, and then she made a mark of black sharp angles near the ship, and her hands shook as she drew. He leaned forward and placed a hand over hers, gently stopping her from drawing more, because her face had gone pale and her breathing quick, and he could see the pain in her eyes as fresh as if whatever happened had just happened yesterday. And he knew then she had lost people, maybe family, maybe friends, and now she was the last one left. She looked at his hand, then at his eyes, and for a moment they sat in silence, and he did not need to speak, because sometimes silence says more than words. and when he removed his hand, she did not flinch, and he knew she had accepted his presence beside her, not as a threat, but as someone who was also broken. That afternoon they walked together, slowly through the forest, staying close and watching the skies, and he kept looking for signs of metal debris or working equipment but found nothing useful, and she followed quietly, pointing at things from time to time, like a guide showing him what not to touch or where to step. When they came upon a hill with a wide view, he stopped and sat with a heavy sigh, and she sat beside him, and the two of them stared at the vast alien world that stretched in every direction, filled with unknown creatures, unknown dangers, but also a kind of wild beauty that could not be denied. As the sky began to change again, with the second sun dipping low and casting red shadows across the land, he gathered dry branches, and she used a strange spark from a tiny tool hidden in her bracelet to light a fire, and they sat beside it, watching the flames and feeling the warmth spread through their tired bodies. Pulled out a small piece of metal he had kept from the crash, a broken piece of a control panel, and began to scrape it against a stone, slowly shaping one edge into something sharp, something useful. And she watched with curious eyes, then took another piece and began doing the same in her own way with her own knowledge. They did not speak in words, but their actions formed a language of rhythm and trust, and every glance, every small nod built something invisible between them, something that needed no translation. When night came fully and the sky lit up with stars and shapes that moved like drifting cities, they lay down near the fire, not touching, but not far, and he listened to the sound of her breathing, and the gentle crackle of the flames, and the distant calls of unknown beasts, and he thought about how strange life had become. He was alone before, and now he was not, and though she could not say his name, and he could not say hers, they had shared food and fire and fear, and it was enough for now. In that moment he realized survival was no longer just about staying alive. It was about staying human, about choosing kindness over fear and hope over despair, even when the world offered nothing but silence and shadows. As sleep finally took him in the warmth of the fire and the presence of the one soul who understood his pain, he dreamed not of earth or rescue, but of walking forward through the unknown together with someone who had lost everything and still chose to live. Days moved like shadows through the strange forest, each morning bringing a new kind of silence, and each night filled with dreams that felt like warnings from the stars above. The man and the girl walked farther each day, searching not for safety, but for meaning, trying to understand where they were and what had taken everything from them. They followed the curve of the hills and crossed shallow rivers that glowed faintly in the dark, and each time they found something new. Sometimes it was a fruit that did not poison, sometimes it was a creature that ran from them before they could look at it clearly, and sometimes it was broken metal half buried in the ground, like a wound left behind by something violent and cold. On one such day, they came upon a valley unlike anything they had seen before, a place that held no color and no wind. The trees were dead, the soil dry and cracked, and in the middle stood the ruins of something that once lived, something that once breathed with voices and warmth and laughter, but now only held silence and dust. The girl stopped at the edge of the ruins, her feet refusing to go forward and her eyes wide with memory. Her hands shook and her lips moved, but no sound came, only the soft sound of her breath growing faster and tighter. And the man reached for her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder, and she looked at him with fear, not of him, but of what they were about to walk into. Nodded slowly, telling her with his eyes that they did not have to go in. But she stepped forward anyway, slow and silent, like a ghost returning to a place she had once called home. The broken walls were scorched and blackened with marks of fire, and something deeper than fire, and the ground was littered with pieces of things he could not name, round objects, shattered long strips of twisted silver, and thin pieces of glass that did not shine anymore. She moved through the ruins like someone walking through a dream, her fingers brushing the surfaces of what once were homes or shelters, and she paused beside a tall stone with markings carved deep into its surface, and She placed her palm against it, closing her eyes and breathing deeply, and he understood. Then that this place had been hers, that this had once been the village or city, or camp where her people lived. She led him deeper into the wreckage, and as they moved he saw signs of struggle, not just destruction, but resistance. Burn marks near narrow doorways, black streaks on the ground that looked like something had been dragged or pulled, and here and there they saw bones not fresh but still untouched, and still waiting to be remembered. The girl knelt beside one of the broken shelters and picked up a small object shaped like a ring or maybe a token, something made for a child, and she held it in her hands for a long time before tucking it away in the folds of her torn cloth, and the man knew she had found something personal, something from someone she loved. He did not speak, and she did not cry, but the weight of loss filled the air between them, and the silence was louder than any voice could be. They sat for a while beneath the largest tree near the edge of the ruins, its branches bare and twisted like arms reaching toward the sky, and the man began to gather his thoughts, piecing together what little he had seen and what little she had shared, and a story began to take shape, not with words, but with images broken and scattered. A ship had come, not his, but hers, filled with people like her. And they had built something here, something small and hidden and peaceful. And then something else had come, not from the sky, but from the ground perhaps, or from the shadows, machines or weapons or creatures, shaped by hands without kindness. And they had taken everything, burned everything, left nothing behind but ash and sorrow. That night they stayed close to the ruins, not because they wanted to, but because the darkness fell too quickly, and the valley held a kind of protection. Even if it also held pain, the fire they built was small and quiet, and the stars above were hidden behind thick clouds that moved without wind. As the fire cracked softly, the girl reached into her wrap and pulled out a thin piece of crystal and handed it to him. He turned it in his fingers, watching as tiny images shimmered across its surface. Shapes of people who looked like her, smiling and waving and dancing beneath the tree that now stood empty and dead. She pointed to the crystal, then to the ruins, then to her heart, and he understood she was not just a survivor, she was a memory bearer. Someone who carried what was lost, not in words, but in feelings and fragments, and in the way she still moved with grace, even in grief. Later that night, when sleep did not come, he wandered the edge of the ruins alone, his thoughts heavy and his heart unsettled, and it was then that he heard it, a low sound, barely more than a whisper, a mechanical hum like the breath of something cold and watching, and he dropped low to the ground, his eyes scanning the dark far across the valley. A single red light blinked once, then vanished, and the hum faded, and he stayed frozen for a long time, waiting, listening, until he was sure it was gone. When he returned to the girl, she was sitting up, eyes wide and alert, and he knew she had felt it too, and without speaking, they both began to pack their few things quickly and quietly, because whatever had been here once was not finished, and whatever had taken her people was still watching, still moving, still hunting. They left the valley at dawn, the fire already dead, and the ruins behind them silent once more. And as they climbed the hill away from the broken village, the girl looked back one last time, her face calm but her eyes sharp with a new strength. She had found her past again, but now she was walking away from it, not in fear but with purpose. And he followed her, not as a leader and not as a protector, but as a partner, someone who understood that survival was not enough, that memory was not enough, that now they had to prepare because something was coming and it would not stop. They moved through thick forest where the light barely touched the ground, and the air was still and heavy with silence that pressed against their skin like invisible hands. The trees were taller here, and their leaves moved without wind, as if they were watching or waiting for something to come. Man walked ahead, clearing branches and stepping carefully, while the girl followed close behind, her steps light and sure, like someone who had walked these kinds of paths before. Their bodies were tired, but their minds were sharp, and every sound, every broken twig, every distant cry made them pause and listen. For 2 days they moved without speaking much, because something had changed since the valley. The ruins had left a mark not only on her heart, but on the space between them. They had shared sorrow, and now they shared something stronger, something made of shared pain and shared purpose. They stopped near a cluster of black rocks that formed a wide open clearing where nothing grew, and the air felt colder than before. The man knelt and began to check the sharp edge of a tool he had made from scrap while the girl crouched nearby drawing symbols in the dust. With a thin stick, her eyes focused her. Hands quick, she drew the shape of the thing they feared, the black shape with the blinking red eye and the long arms that ended in claws, and the sharp legs that moved without sound. She pointed at it, then at the forest behind them, then at the sky above, and he understood that it was near, not just watching, but searching and closing. And that night, they did not light a fire. Instead, they sat close behind a wide fallen tree covered in thick moss and watched the sky where strange lights moved slowly across the stars, not like stars, not like ships, but like eyes searching through the dark. Then the sound returned, soft and low, a deep hum like the breath of a sleeping beast. And the man grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her low into the brush, their bodies flat against the earth, their hearts beating like drums in their chests. Above the tree, something passed silently, something black and smooth and shaped like a sting that floated without wings and turned without sound, its eye blinking slowly like it was thinking or dreaming. And they watched it hover over the clearing, then move to the east, following a pattern known only to it. They waited a long time after it vanished, their breaths held, their fingers still before they moved again. And when they did, they moved fast, running low and quiet through the brush until their lungs burned and their legs shook, and the trees opened suddenly to a narrow ledge that overlooked a wide canyon filled with clouds that glowed from within. The man fell to his knees, breathing hard, while the girl stood behind him watching the edge, as if deciding whether to run or to fight. And then she pulled something from her wrist, a small device with cracked glass and wires that sparked weakly, and she showed it to him, pointing at the light that blinked on its surface. He took it from her hands and studied it, then nodded slowly because he understood it was not just a map, it was a memory. It was part of the old ship, maybe the same one that had brought her here, and it was calling to something, calling to a signal hidden deep inside the canyon. They looked at each other, and without words they agreed they would go down together. They would not run, they would not hide. They would find what remained, and if they had to face the thing that hunted them, then they would do it on their feet, not on their knees. The descent was hard, the rocks were sharp and loose, and the clouds burned slightly where they touched the skin. But they kept moving, helped each other across broken paths and narrow turns. And when they reached the bottom, they found a strange shape buried in the mist, a shell of something metal and ancient, with one side torn open like a wound inside. The broken ship, the light flickered weakly, and wires hung from the ceiling like vines, and the air smelled of rust and old fire. The girl stepped forward first, and the lights blinked brighter, as if recognizing her, and the man followed his eyes, scanning every corner for signs of danger. She moved to a small console and placed her hand on its surface, and the screen came alive with symbols that danced across the glass, and he watched her face change from fear to hope as she pressed her fingers into the lights, and the machine began to hum with power again. A voice filled the air, soft and distant, not human, not alien, just old, like it had waited for someone to return, and now that someone was here, it began to send a signal into the sky, a call that reached beyond clouds and stars and silence. They stood together, watching the light rise from the ship like a pillar of fire reaching toward the heavens, and for a moment, it felt like everything had stopped, even the wind, even the fear, even the memory of being hunted. But the peace did not last. Ground shook and the walls trembled, and the red light appeared at the edge of the canyon, blinking faster, now sharper now, and the sound of claws against rock echoed through the mist as the shape came closer. The man grabbed a long pole from the wreck and stood before the opening, his feet firm and his eyes hard, while the girl pulled wires from the wall and began to connect them into a weapon made of what was left and what still worked. The thing came into view, tall and thin, with arms that moved like knives and an eye that burned like a silent scream, and it paused when it saw them, as if confused by the fact that they stood and did not run. then it leaped. Man swung hard with all his strength, and the pole connected with the creature's side, sending sparks into the air. But the thing did not fall. It turned with sharp grace and slashed with its arm, cutting his shoulder deep and hot. He fell to one knee but rose again, blood running down his side, and he shouted not in words but in rage and will, and brought the pole down again, this time with fury, not fear, and the creature staggered in that moment. The girl released the wires, and a blast of blue light struck the machine in its center, and its eye flared, then faded, and the body collapsed into dust and ash that scattered into the wind. The silence returned slowly, and the light from the console turned green, and the girl stepped outside and raised the signal again, this time with a steady hand, while the man leaned against the wall, breathing heavy but alive. They had faced the storm and stood tall. They had faced the shadow and held their ground now. The world waited for what came next, and somewhere above the clouds, something was listening. Sky above the canyon remained quiet for a long time after the creature had fallen, and the signal had been sent, and the man sat beside the shattered console with his hand pressed against his wound, while the girl stood at the ship's broken edge, her eyes watching the clouds as if they might part at any moment and bring with them an answer. She looked different, now stronger, not only in her stance but in her presence. The fear that once lived in her steps had been replaced by something deeper, something born from pain but shaped by choice. She had not only survived, she had fought, and now she stood like someone who remembered who she was. Man did not speak, but his breathing had slowed, and his eyes were half closed, not from sleep, but from the ache of too many days without rest and too many nights wondering if they would ever be found. The ship's light still pulsed, quietly sending its signal across the sky, and the girl walked toward him, carrying the small container made from scrap metal filled with crushed leaves and clean water. He drank slowly and nodded in thanks, and she sat beside him, the silence between them, soft and warm, not empty, not lonely, but full of all the things they had shared without words. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small object, something he had found long ago during one of their early searches, a tiny piece of Earth tech, chipped and burned, but still shaped like a beacon. He held it in his palm, then offered it to her, and she took it gently, her fingers brushing his. And for a moment, their eyes met, and in that glance they told each other everything. They had no language, but they no longer needed one. Then the sky cracked open with a deep roar that rolled across the canyon like thunder without rain, and they both looked up to see a light descending, not red, not cold, but bright and wide like the sun rising before dawn. And the man stood slowly, his body still aching, but his heart suddenly full of something he had not felt in a long time. Hope. The rescue craft came down with the grace of a falling feather, its sides marked with both human and alien pattern symbols, mixed together as if two histories had finally decided to speak to each other. And the hatch opened with a hiss of warm air, and the voice of someone familiar but strange called from within, "Only one of you can come aboard." The words were not cruel, but they struck like stone, and the man looked at the girl, who was already shaking her head, who was already stepping back, who was already pointing at him, as if the choice had already been made. He took a breath and stepped forward, but she blocked him, her hands out, her eyes fierce, and he tried to explain with gestures that it was her who needed to go, that her world was already gone, and his was still out there, and she could be safe, and she could be known, and she could carry the memory of her people beyond this place. She shook her head again and drew a circle on her chest, then pointed at him and made the sign they had used to mean together, and his throat tightened because he understood what she was saying, even if he wished she was wrong. Then he did something she did not expect. He reached out and touched her shoulder, and when she looked at him confused, he brought his forehead to hers gently, and in that soft gesture he told her, "Thank you and goodbye, and I believe in you, and I will wait." He stepped back and with one quick movement struck a hidden point on her bracelet, and she collapsed into his arms, not harmed, just sleeping, and he carried her to the craft and laid her inside and whispered words she could not hear, but he hoped she would feel them later. The hatch closed and the ship rose again slowly then faster, and disappeared into the sky, leaving behind the canyon, the ship, the silence, and him. Stood alone again, but not broken, not afraid. He looked around and saw the place not as a prison, but as a beginning, and he knew others would come, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not soon, but they would come, and when they did, they would find the story written in the stone and the ash and in the wind time. Passed not in days, but in moments. He built small shelters, fixed what tools he could, gathered food with practiced care, and each evening he climbed the ridge and watched the sky, waiting for a sign. One morning, long after the clouds had shifted and the season had changed, he heard the sound again. Not a hum, not a threat, but a song carried on engines not meant to kill, and he stood at the edge of the canyon, heart pounding, as a new ship came into view. This one was larger, slower, its sides covered in new marks, and from its open door came a voice. He remembered, not in sound but in feeling, and when the hatch opened fully, he saw her standing there wrapped in clean cloth, her face calm and her eyes wet. She stepped down with others behind her, people of many shapes and colors, and she walked toward him without a word, and when she reached him, she placed her hand over his heart, then over her own. Then she spoke with a voice that was no longer broken. I told them humans do not leave family. The others around her began to explore, began to collect, began to understand, but the man and the girl stood still for a long time, surrounded by the wind and the trees and the stars above. Their story was not a legend of war or glory or power. It was a story of choice, of staying when it was easier to run, of holding on when everything said to let go, of standing beside someone not because they were the same, but because they had both lost something and found something better. Each of them had arrived on the world alone, afraid and bare, but they had left it with something greater than safety. They had left it with each other. And in the end, that was what saved them, not the signal, not the ship, but the decision to stay and the courage to care. The end.